All right, I think we should start. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes? Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning, to those brave enough to come here physically to the Stimson Center, as well as those who are probably wiser to have joined us through live stream in their comforts of their homes and offices. For those who do not know me, my name is Lovely Umayam, and I manage the nuclear security portfolio here at the Stimson Center. For those who are not familiar with the Stimson Center, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank specializing on a wide range of international security issues, may that be the refugee crisis, illicit drug trafficking, and in this case, nuclear security. And all of the experts here at Stimson, try to go by what we call the Henry L. Stimson Creed, which is to seek pragmatic solutions to ideal objectives. So we're really tasked to not only think big ideas, but also to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work to ensure that our big ideas are actually attuned to the realities on the ground, are viable, and are actually sustainable. And so for the nuclear security portfolio, for example, we not only think about or share insights about the high policy level issues like the nuclear security summits, but we also do the in the weeds work. We look at very niche areas like nuclear liability, which is what we're going to be discussing today. And so the work this morning is really about that deeper dive. So we will hear from some of our speakers today talk about this roundtable that the nuclear security team just organized last fall. We were in London, where we sat with nuclear insurers and nuclear lawyers to look at emerging or evolving security issues in the nuclear sector and what the liability implications are, may that be civil or criminal. And actually, Stimson, we just released today our summary of findings from that roundtable. It'll be available online, and it's also on your agendas in front of you. But while we're going to be talking about that roundtable, we also want to broaden that discussion so that we could really look at or take stock of the work that's been done before and how that has helped us get to where we are. For example, we, along with the World Institute for Nuclear Security, there are another think tank based in Vienna who's been working on this issue for 2011. We've really partnered up to really think through these issues. So part of our conversation today will be to reflect on what has happened since 2011, what were some of the unforeseeable challenges, and some of the possible paths forward. With that said, I am grateful that we are joined by an esteemed line of experts. I will be providing an abbreviated version of their very distinguished careers. So if you're interested in learning more, their bios will be online and also in the agendas. First, we have Secretary Michael Chertoff, the executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, which is a global advisory firm with expertise in risk management in the energy sector. He also served as senior counsel at Covington and Burling and was appointed Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009, in which one of his more important functions is risk management for the critical infrastructures around the country. We also have Mr. Ray Biagini, a counselor and litigator at Covington and Burling. He is a tort defense lawyer and has worked on several high-profile cases, including the Exxon Valdez litigation. And he also provides and develops risk prevention and mitigation programs to government and private entities. And in 2015, Mr. Biagini was named Law 360 MVP. And on the TV screens and on the phone, we are joined by Mr. Stephen Tromans, who is a barrister and Queen's Counsel at 39 Essex Chambers, which is located in London. He specializes in environmental and resources law and has been an instrumental part in facilitating the roundtable that we actually organized in last fall. He helped us gather some of the best legal minds to really take on these liability challenges. And last but not the least, we have Catherine Rout, who is a non-resident fellow here at the Stimson Center, and I would say is a primary brainchild of the nuclear liability work that we do here, and has really witnessed the growth of the project. So with that, again, thank you for coming, and I will hand it off to Catherine for the deeper dive. Yeah?
Thank you. Again, welcome. And we are joined here by such a powerhouse of legal knowledge. I am so honored to have both Ray Biagini, Secretary Chertoff, and Stephen Tromans, because they were all part of the journey of how we got from when we started to think about these ideas in 2011. So Roger Housley actually hired me. He's the director of the World Institute of Nuclear Security in 2011 as a strategic advisor to start looking at some of these very, very complex and esoteric issues surrounding legal liability. Because he couldn't understand what the lawyers were telling him, which is that due diligence didn't matter, that it was strict liability, and that there was no way that you could incentivize an operator because the liability was the same for the best and the worst performers in the event of a nuclear incident. So we basically had to really pull that apart and tease it down, and I decided to go to the best in the business. I contacted Secretary Chertoff's office. It was not easy. I was calling from Vienna. I didn't know him. I had to actually befriend his admin. I think we talked about my ball gown a couple of times.
She's left since then, so.
And so basically when he finally understood that I was trying to fly him into Vienna to discuss these issues, he was very, very thrilled to participate, because risk management is really what he created at the Department of Homeland Security. He really changed the way we think about risk management. And I also went for the top litigator, Exxon Valdez, and we can go on and on and on in terms of the tort litigation that Ray Biagini has masterminded. And he is just an amazing defense lawyer. And most recently, I have met Stephen Tromans. We actually tried to connect with Stephen over the last couple of years because we heard that in terms of nuclear law, he was the premier barrister. And finally, we were able to meet with him about 6 or 7 months ago and put together, well, I cannot say that we put together the roundtable. He put together this table with his with the other barristers. They did a phenomenal job. They had former court judges as the actual barristers or not the barristers, as the actual judges who ruled on our hypothetical scenario and our verdict, and who gave the verdict at the end of the day. So it was a tremendous success, and we released our paper. The trajectory of this was that Roger Housley and I started to think 6 or 7 years ago about how you could stimulate and incentivize nuclear operators to voluntarily adopt more robust nuclear security measures so that we did not have to continue to have external mandatory standards. And it was not easy. We went through a number of different incentives, both intrinsic and extrinsic, including insurance, credit rating, loan preferences, and it turned out that the one that was the most, really generated the most interest by far was the potential for liability. So what I had to do then was figure out how to get around the liability conventions. And when we had our first roundtable in Vienna, as I said, in December 2011, we basically had a big bar fight. It was a really, really tough day. There was so much opposition by the nuclear lawyers and the Department of Energy and the IAEA around this idea of tort liability, because they assured us that these conventions were in place and that there would absolutely be no liability outside of those conventions. So we basically plowed through the day. I had these amazing people on my side of the table. I had the best and the brightest, so I knew that I was on the right path. But afterwards, I distinctly remember corresponding with Secretary Chertoff and asking him for advice, and he said, "This is a tough nut to crack, and what you need to do is find a large liability outside of the conventions." I talked to Ray, I think called me from the airport because we were still trying to get over this, intense day of opposition to our ideas. And he said, "I'm looking at a sign in the airport that says, think bold, think big, think out of the box." And we started coming up with ideas, one of which was nuclear power is there to produce energy. What about a blackout? What about a blackout that doesn't cause a release of radiation? And it turns out that there are so many different things that could happen if you had a terrorist event, a cyber terrorist event, a physical cyber event, only one of which is covered by the nuclear liability regimes, and that is if there is a release of radiation above the threshold amount. So now that we're talking to the operators, we understand that they really are interested in these second-order threats, as they call them now. So they're actually even talking in Europe and elsewhere about the second-order threats, which would be cyber without a release of radiation, any kind of a terrorist attack, a blackout, business interruption. Reputation is, of course, the number one. Well, I mean, security and safety are huge, but reputation is a gigantic motivator as well. I'm going to talk through this quickly because I know that Ray is going to touch on some of the history of the civil and criminal liability around terrorist events. But we definitely know now that there is a huge movement towards accountability. We see this in Fukushima, where when the prosecutors tried to overturn the indictments, the citizen suits moved against the three TEPCO executives to ensure that they were indicted and held accountable. In Deepwater Horizon, we had, I think the biggest fine in history at that time was $39 billion by the Department of Justice. And there were criminal indictments. I think in the end they ended up being misdemeanors, but certainly there was accountability in both of those situations and in many different others. So we're really challenging the assumptions that are around the traditional nuclear liability regimes, and in doing that, we wanted to create something that, essentially what we were doing is looking at the fact that you are probably going to be sued. If there's an event, you will absolutely be sued. Hopefully there won't be an event, but basically what we're trying to do is the proactive planning. And we're looking from the litigation and then we're walking it backwards to understand what would the evidence be, what is the record, how do you build your case? And I know that Ray is also going to talk about this because he was very excited about our governance template. But what we found is at the Nuclear Security Industry Summit, there was a template, it was a governance template that was in an appendix to a paper. So how we found it, I don't know. But there was an amazing governance template that we said, oh my gosh, this is amazing. WINS had created it with the Canadian Nuclear Association. And we've taken that, we again are trying to walk back towards, how would you build your case? And we're looking at that governance template and we're comparing it to other best practices, to the IAEA guidance. And essentially what it will do is it would be a written record that would be part of your case if something were to happen. Again, it's, I think one of the things that I was just talking to Secretary Chertoff about is that operators are going to be, they are completely and totally overwhelmed by the number of requirements, especially in the cyber arena. And they say, how much is enough? I can't do everything. And so I think that what we really want to explain is that this is, you don't need to do everything. You only need to do that which is reasonable under the circumstances. But we don't know what is reasonable under the circumstances in nuclear because we don't have the benchmarks. So we are actually approaching industry and saying to industry, let's develop those benchmarks together. You help us. What would be practical? Where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? And so that this would further incentivize them. I think the, this is, certainly we are coming full circle here. I want this to be an informal event. I want everyone to ask questions. We really want to, as Lovely said, dig down deeper into these issues. It isn't about me talking or anyone else getting up here and lecturing. It's really about trying to dig deeper into these issues. And we have these three phenomenal experts. I'm so happy I can't actually see Stephen Tromans, but I know he's here, and I am going to just turn it over to Secretary Chertoff.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And just a little heads up, I've got a hard stop at 11:45, so I'm going to slip out quietly. So let me just make a couple of observations. I'm not a tort lawyer. I was a criminal lawyer, and still do some of that, and was a judge. And I absolutely agree with what Catherine said. If there was a serious event, there would be a criminal dimension to this, not just a civil dimension. And even putting aside the regimes that there are with respect to release of radioactive material that deal with the issue of civil liability, I will guarantee you there would be criminal cases that come out of that because the public pressure would be enormous. The challenge in cyber is, as Catherine said, is how much is enough. And so some general observations. First, it's about managing the risk. In cyber events, you cannot eliminate the risk unless you simply have nothing online. So how do you know what the risk is that you have to manage? We generally look at three variables. We look at threat, what are the likely threats, vulnerability, how do we reduce our vulnerability, and mostly what is the consequence we're most worried about. There are some things that are fairly low consequence that you're not going to invest a huge amount in. Some things are very high consequence, and obviously you will, but you also have to look at the issue of probability. And I think as we said here, apart from the obvious issue of release of radioactive material, if you just look at Puerto Rico, look how many months it's been since we had Irma, and the power is still off. And I can tell you from 4 years of being at the head of DHS and dealing with a lot of different natural disasters, power is generally the foundational capability for any kind of recovery. If your power is out, everything else goes. And so the consequences there are very, very high. There are additional consequences that may be a little less obvious. If you are connected through power generation with other entities and other enterprises, and you are penetrated by malware, that malware can migrate to other entities. If you looked at the Target hack, Target was hacked because the heating and cooling guy came in, hooked up to the system, and wound up introducing malware into the Target system. Here in Washington, the Chamber of Commerce was hacked by a foreign entity through a thermostat in a remote building that was wirelessly connected to its overall data and network. And as we get to the so-called Internet of Things, the number of connections is dramatically increasing. So there are consequences to flow from that. There are issues with respect to even your ability to operate your system reliably. We've seen instances in the past where people have hacked into utilities or other power generation enterprises, and what they've done is they've eliminated the ability to monitor what is actually going on in your network and how you're actually operating with your industrial control system. And then that makes it very difficult to adjust simply in order to deal with maintaining a constant level of service. So all of these are the kinds of consequences you would have to deal with. The threat actors here are a wide range of folks. There are activists, people who don't like nuclear power, and they want to make a statement by shutting you down or doing something to interfere with your operation. There are nation-state actors. In 2015 and 2016, in the Ukraine, the power went out in a certain part of the Ukraine because there were cyber attacks on a substation and on the industrial control systems that for a period of time put them offline. And often those are accompanied by something that makes it difficult to determine exactly where the problem is, so they make recovery more difficult. Also, those of you who followed the events in Metcalf, California a few years ago, there was a combined physical cyber attack on a transformer, which involved both efforts to destroy the transformer by shooting it, but also taking offline some of the communications and monitoring elements that would have been used to determine where the problem was. And happily, the perpetrators here did it at a time of year when it was actually redundant and it didn't have much of an impact. But the point is, these are all potential threat actors and vectors. So on the issue of vulnerability, the question becomes, what do you do to reduce the vulnerability? And it is true, there is no prescriptive standard that tells you exactly what you have to do. There are some data points out there. For example, NIST at the Department of Commerce has put out a general set of considerations that you have to look to in order to determine whether you have some degree of cybersecurity. And certainly you'd be remiss if you didn't look at those standards and make sure you're at least addressing each of the elements that they put there. But these tend to be very general. They don't get very prescriptive. And the truth is, to really do the job properly, you need to understand the architecture of your system. You need to understand who has access to it. There are issues you want to deal with, like who has privileges to do things online. How do you determine whether someone is who they say they are? That's the issue of identification. How do you segment your network? There's no reason that your billing function, which is automated and online, needs to be connected to your industrial control system. But I will tell you that the biggest problem I've seen people have, actually there are two of them. One is they don't really understand the architecture of their own network. And if I had a nickel for every time somebody told me, oh, we're disconnected from the internet, we don't have any connections, and they turned out they were wrong, I wouldn't be here because I'd be retired and sitting on a beach somewhere. So mapping your network, knowing who can get on it, how they can get on it, and what they have the privilege to do is one of the key things you have to do. The second issue is the insider threat. People inside the organization who maliciously or through carelessness allow malware to be introduced in the system. So if I was going to start baselining what I would do in terms of cybersecurity, I would look at those two elements first.
Thank you. Stephen, perhaps you could give the audience, which has, unless they got up early and read the very short paper, they probably don't know very much about the actual hypothetical scenario and the mock trial. So perhaps you could just give a very quick rundown of that, and then I'm really just interested also in the idea of setting standards and doing so with the insurance industry.
Yeah, great. Hello, Catherine and everyone else. I'm sorry you can't see me. I can't see you either, but I hope you can hear me okay.
Oh, no, we can see you. You're on screens. You're on two very large screens, so we definitely can see you.
Okay. Excellent, good. I can't see you, so I just have to imagine how good-looking you all are on stage. Well, perhaps I could begin just by giving my own perspective from the stance of a UK lawyer in relation to the nuclear sector and the growing importance of cyber security, and then lead into the round table that we had. I've worked really since the early 1990s in advising the nuclear sector and sometimes the regulators of the nuclear sector and sometimes the insurers of the nuclear sector. And the initial focus very much was on safety and liability, so physical safety and the consequences of nuclear releases, nuclear accidents. It's obviously always been a sector where high standards are demanded and considerable attention is paid to governance arrangements within operators to ensure adequate resources, personnel and systems get devoted to safety. And that's clearly an important issue in relation to security and cybersecurity as well. It's an area where performance is driven very much by international standards, so looking at what the international benchmarks are from the IAEA and other relevant organisations, and also by, certainly in the UK, I'm sure elsewhere, a specialist inspectorate, an inspectorate which has detailed, in-depth knowledge of the sector and the engineering and the science behind it. And during the period of the 1990s and 2000s, we started to see within nuclear regulation quite frequent reference to the term safety culture. So what was important wasn't just physically what people did, it was the culture of the organisation. And I think that's a very important theme, which we'll come on to when we look at the round table. Then there began to be an increased focus on nuclear security and a need for equal attention to be given to nuclear security as to safety. And initially the emphasis here was on physical security, so ensuring physical security of the nuclear installation, people couldn't get in and damage it or do anything untoward in relation to it, and on the physical security of information, so ensuring that people couldn't take away memory sticks, copies of documents, etc. Now, with the increased threat, sadly, of terrorism, so much more exacting standards have been applied in that area. And cybersecurity, it seems to me, is essentially a further iteration or further dimension of those established areas of regulation and standards. And it's probably only been seen as an issue in the UK over the last couple of years, I'd say. Maybe it's longer in the US, I don't know. But it's definitely, very definitely now on the radar screen. Of course, it could be an issue for any company which holds sensitive information, not just the nuclear sector. But I think the important point is that the risks within the nuclear sector are particularly severe, not only in relation to interference with the infrastructure of the nuclear sector, but also the loss of information which could be used in a bad way elsewhere. And it doesn't, of course, mean that there necessarily has to be a nuclear incident in the sense of a release of radiation in order to give rise to those issues. The two important points here. First of all, the criminal law around nuclear is based on risk, so there does not have to be a harmful event in order to give rise to criminal liability. All there has to be are circumstances which present the risk of such an event, and the courts will deal with that risk, in many cases, almost as harshly as if the risk had eventuated. Secondly, of course, a breach of security at a nuclear power station could give rise to very serious consequences for the public and for third parties, even if there is no release of radiation. If alarms get triggered, if false information is put out, then people may take steps by way of evacuation or emergency response in advance of a possible release, which may have huge economic consequences, those scenarios would not be dealt with under the conventions on releases of radiation because there has been no release. It would be dealt with on ordinary criminal and civil law. So that is very much where we focused our attention in relation to the scenario. And it seemed to us in devising the scenario that the challenge is always on getting senior management within a company to focus on the issue and to give it sufficient priority amid all the other calls on management time and resources. Within the UK, there is no legal precedent for this sort of scenario. We couldn't look at an existing case or a past case and say that provides us with a scenario. So we're working from analogy with other areas, and I think that the two key areas to focus on, and which we did focus on in this scenario, are the standard of care which is to be applied to a company, and secondly, issues of chain of causation. If someone, a terrorist or ill-wisher, does do something which compromises security, does that break the chain of causation in a tort sense? Can the company say, not really our fault, it's the fault of the person who carried out the terrorist activity? But the tools for approaching those questions will be, it seems to me, the same as for non-nuclear areas, issues such as foreseeability, due diligence, and reasonable precautions. And it's a matter of applying those concepts to potentially novel situations. So we believe it was useful to run the scenario we did. As Catherine said, the scenario concerned effectively a power outage caused by cybersecurity being compromised, which has very considerable effects on the public, on the tourist industry of the country concerned, etc., and led to both civil claims and to criminal prosecutions. One of the issues that we looked at in the context of the day of discussion we had was the usefulness of general IAEA standards, such as on risk management. How far can one bring across general concepts of risk management recognised within the nuclear industry, perhaps in other contexts, and bring those to bear on cybersecurity? Yes, one can, but we have to bear in mind, I think, how fast-moving the area of cybersecurity is. That seems to me to be a very big difference to traditional nuclear safety. Within traditional nuclear safety, things tend to move quite slowly. Very often, security or safety changes come about as a result of responses to accidents, such as 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, etc. There is discussions to how things should change in terms of safety, and it's all done at a fairly measured pace. Now, cybersecurity, it seems to me, and certainly that accords with what Michael just said, moves very fast because one is dealing with hackers, other states, terrorists, criminals who are themselves developing their schemes very quickly, and there's a need to be very light on your feet in responding to those challenges. We looked in our scenario at whether the company was liable, and we looked at whether senior management was liable under normal principles of UK corporate and criminal law. Were they the controlling mind of the company? Were they sufficiently high up in the company? Were they guilty of the term we use in the UK, connivance, in relation to the offence committed by the company? In other words, did they know that the company was creating a risk that turned a blind eye to that? Or did they neglect their duties within the company? That will always depend upon consideration of the detailed facts, and therefore any scenario is always of limited usefulness, but can be very illuminative as to how a court would approach it. And we had 2 very experienced judges who looked at the scenario and did find that the company had failed to address security adequately, that the management didn't accord sufficient value to security issues. So, for example, where audits have been carried out which have revealed defects, those were not followed up. And there was also a finding that the CEO and the Chief Security Officer had been guilty of connivance in the sense that they had been personally very aware of these breaches and had effectively turned a blind eye to them, not taken the appropriate action or investigated further. So we looked at the adoption of a template, how helpful would that be? The conclusion was, yes, it would be helpful, but I think an important caveat to that is that the rules are not enough. One can have rules in place, one can put in place a system, if you like, of reasonable precaution, but you must also ensure that those rules are applied, which involves the exercise of due diligence on an ongoing day-to-day basis. In a sense, to have a set of rules and not apply them is almost worse than having no rules at all. And just to conclude in the last couple of minutes, there are two important factors, it seems to me, there which came out of the scenario and come out of my own experience in dealing with the nuclear industry. One is the critical importance of human factors. That's something which I think is part of the safety culture I mentioned earlier, has just been recognised relatively recently within the industry, but the importance of training, adequate resourcing, responsibility at board level, so that there is a way in which these issues can be funneled through to the board and can be addressed at senior board level. Do board meetings give enough time and space to consider these issues? They're not jostled out by other, perhaps more financially compelling issues, so that's certainly one factor. The other factor, which I think is very important, may lead on to some of the discussion, is the concept of the intelligent customer. That's very important in terms of nuclear safety in the UK, because of course companies will very often contract out, for instance, the design, the building, the operation, in some cases, of nuclear facilities to specialist outsiders. There's nothing in itself wrong with that, but what is very important is that the operator retains within the company sufficient expertise to understand whether it's getting good advice and good service or not. It cannot abdicate its responsibility to understand safety. The same is true, I think, that it cannot abdicate its responsibility to understand security and the ways in which its security may be compromised. The fact that it has external security consultants will not absolve it from its own responsibilities to understand and respond to those threats within the company. So those are my initial comments. I was very grateful that Catherine and Stimson did reach out to us and that we held the event which we did. I think those who were there found it a very stimulating day and a very useful day. I've only here been able to give you a little flavour of it, but hopefully you've got an idea of some of the lessons which were learned from it.
Thank you
Thanks very much. Those are my comments.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now, so we're talking about the governance template as one way to limit liability. I'm going to ask Ray to talk about, he actually engineered and drafted the Safety Act, which is another way to limit liability in the United States, and he's going to talk about his experience in that arena.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here again with my partner, Secretary Chertoff, and nice to meet Stephen for the first time. Catherine, thanks for having me back. So as I understand it, what we're talking about here is the event where there's a non-radiological release or non-radiological event that's caused, say, by a terrorist that leads to potential catastrophic liability to third parties, both personal injury, wrongful death, and business interruption. And as Secretary Chertoff said, if that event occurs, that non-radiological event occurs, there will be lawsuits, absolutely. There will be criminal investigations. There will be civil lawsuits. Whether that event occurs in the U.S. or outside the U.S., there will be lawsuits more than likely in the U.S. Why? Because the U.S. likes to give away money. The juries love to give away money. And if plaintiffs can find a way into the U.S. courts, and there are various ways, although they're skinnying those down now more recently, but even foreign nationals who want to sue in the U.S. that feel they were harmed outside the U.S., they can sometimes find their way into U.S. courts. And with an event of the type we're talking about, you could probably rest assured we're in America, everybody will get sued. So what I want to talk about are two things. I want to talk about what I view as the liability landscape in the U.S. and give you my views about what that is, kind of similar to what Stephen did in the UK. And then a few comments about the notion of a template and a governance template in the nuclear industry. So let's just hit the highlights. Major domestic terrorist attack, Oklahoma City, resulted in a big lawsuit. Wasn't a nuclear event, but it was a major terrorist attack on the Murrah building. Lawsuits flowed right after that, brought by Johnny Cochran. You may remember him. He sued the fertilizer industry and claimed that the fertilizer industry was liable for all of that because they didn't make the fertilizer inert and incapable of being converted to a bomb. In that case, and we represented some of the fertilizer industry defendants there, we were successfully able to argue that the criminal terrorist attack severed the chain of causation. Therefore, the fertilizer industry was not liable. The guys that were liable were the ones that actually blew up the building. Made sense, and the federal court there agreed. World Trade Center 1, okay, so when the garage bombing occurred, remember that in 1993, the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey was sued. That lawsuit lasted almost 10 years. A lot of money was spent on defense costs in that suit. And along the way, the Port Authority, it's almost surprising, they were found liable for what? There had been a vulnerability assessment study done about 5 years before that garage bombing. The vulnerability assessment said you either stop having a parking lot underground here, or you have to put in and spend the money to put in a lot of security, cameras and so forth. And the Port Authority didn't do those things. So the allegation was that they had failed to follow the recommendations of the vulnerability assessment consultant. And it went to trial, and the jury found that the Port Authority was 68% liable for failing to follow the vulnerability assessment recommendations. And the terrorists were 32% liable. Now, ultimately, after battling that out, the highest court in New York finally said, in a 4-3 decision, Port Authority, you're really like a sovereign. We're going to give you sovereign immunity this time around. Don't count it all on the future. It always happen that way, but we'll give it to you this time. So that erased that decision. However, it scared the heck out of, as Secretary Chertoff well knows, the Port Authority in terms of potential for future events like that. That event, by the way, is somewhat similar, isn't it, to your hypothetical, Stephen, that you had on the Silver Strand nuclear power plant. And then the other major event, of course, was 9/11. 9/11 occurs, and there is, in those lawsuits that followed against the port authorities, against security providers at the airports, there's the first big organic change in our law, which then said, well, unlike Oklahoma City, terrorist attacks are foreseeable. And we are going to hold all these security companies in the lawsuit. They're not going to exit lawsuits like the fertilizer industry did. And the courts there said to the airports and the airport security, you're staying in the lawsuit, you're going to battle it out now, and you're going to spend a lot of money trying to get yourselves out of this. And so they basically said, in that case, commandeering a commercial aircraft and ramming it into the side of the World Trade Center was a foreseeable event. Now, that's where we are now in the U.S. The other thing that strikes me, to make sure everyone understands, in the U.S., mere compliance with regulations, so if you're in the nuclear industry, you've got a lot of regulations you have to follow and so forth. Mere compliance doesn't get you a lot when you're in court. It hardly, once in a while, it may create a rebuttable presumption that you weren't negligent in what you were doing, but for the most part, it's just indicia of reasonable activity. It doesn't carry the day. So just complying with the minimal standards that the regulations set doesn't get you a whole lot when you're in court. You need to do it. You absolutely need to do it. But don't think it's going to be a panacea or a magic bullet to get out of the court, out of the case that you get sued in. So the question that's pending really is, how do we incent nuclear operators to develop even better practices? You guys are probably doing very good things now. But how do we incent? What are those, as the motto is, what are the practical steps toward ideal objectives? How do we incent the industry to do even better, to plan better, to implement better, and actually sometimes place security above cost, above schedule? Sometimes cost and schedule already trumps security. So we have to worry about that balance. So in the U.S., what we've done, and I'll comment on what Europe has done or not done, but in the U.S. since 9/11, what we've tried to do here, it seems, is set up a federal statutory incentive regime in a couple different ways. First thing we did in 2002 is we passed the Safety Act, something I did author. I authored the core provisions. What the Safety Act is, I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but let me just try to, in very short order, tell you what it is. It's a federal law. It says if you have anti-terror technology, or if you're deploying anti-terror security processes, plans, protocols, risk mitigation strategies at your facilities, and you submit those processes that you follow to the Department of Homeland Security, they review them, they conclude that they are effective, that they're mature processes, that you actually have manuals that show you how to implement your security processes and protocols, your both physical and cyber processes. DHS says, they are effective. We like what you do here. You've deployed these for many years. They seem reliable. We are going to approve these as covered under the Safety Act. What does that mean to you? What that means to you is that if there then is an act of terrorism involving your nuclear site, involving those processes, those security processes, and you get sued over theirs, and the plaintiffs come in and say, wow, those processes were not very good, and they were not very well implemented, and you missed this one, you didn't have that one. You have the Department of Homeland Security having given you Safety Act protection in a document that you will submit to the court. It's called Exhibit A. It will describe what the Department of Homeland Security has approved, what processes they've approved, and so forth. You will move then to dismiss that lawsuit against you, because the protection that you get is a presumption of dismissal from the lawsuit that gets filed after an act of terrorism. That's the major protection. There are a number of others. You also cannot be sued for punitive damages. You can only be sued in our federal courts, not our state courts. And if you happen to be found liable, you are capped at your insurance limits. So it's a major, major piece of risk mitigation statutory regime. It has been very active. The Safety Act Office under DHS has approved over 950 different types of anti-terror technologies and security procedures. And it applies extraterritorially. So if there is an act of terrorism outside of the U.S. at a nuclear site, let's say there's U.S. interests embedded in that site, there are contractors that are there and so forth that help design it or that are operating it, and there's a terrorist attack there, and the suits then flow in the U.S., the Safety Act can protect those that touch that facility. Importantly for nuclear events, non-radiological events, the Safety Act also defeats business interruption claims. So it isn't just the people that were injured or killed that bring the suit. Sometimes third-party businesses will say, hey, because I didn't have power for 3 weeks, I got a big, big check I want you to write for me because I've been out of business for the last four weeks. Business interruption claims are also defeated under the Safety Act. It's a little statute. It's about 6 pages long, but it's very powerful. Let me comment on 3 different examples that I think are very apt for this audience that reflect how the Safety Act is utilized in the United States to lift industries' practices, which is what we're trying to do here. As I understand it, we were trying to figure out ways to incent even better practices. A couple of examples. The first airport in the United States that got Safety Act coverage was one called the Kentucky International Airport. And I remember when we did that application, before they awarded it, the Department of Homeland Security folks called me and they said, well, we're looking at this, we're very interested, we think we're going to give an award to you, but tell us why you think you ought to get this super duper protection, presumption of dismissal from the lawsuits. And I said, because this entity goes above and beyond complying with regulations. They go the extra step, and here's how they do it. I pointed out 10 different ways that they've exceeded regulations that govern the airports. And I said, by giving coverage to the department, to this airport, guess what's going to happen? When you announce that to the outside world, it will signal to other airports that in order to get this highest form of protection, you too need to go above and beyond. Now you're lifting that industry. You're incentivizing that industry, the airport security industry, to do better than just what is minimal compliance. And that's what happened. So Kentucky got the first one, and then JFK, then Newark, and then so forth. That's an example of a federal liability protection regime having a sort of ripple effect through an industry. Secretary Chertoff mentioned industrial control systems. So key in this industry, right? We just got Safety Act coverage for a major supplier of industrial control systems to the nuclear and power industries. And they also were able to show they go above and beyond in the design, development, and deployment of those systems. Physical security guard services that protect nuclear facilities, many of them already have Safety Act coverage. Lastly, I would mention currently doing an application that's been submitted to DHS for a major utility company in the U.S. And what is it for? The application is seeking Safety Act coverage for all of their risk management processes and protocols, the decision-making processes they use to decide how much and what type of security to deploy in and around their substations and so forth. And what I was struck by going through this process, literally as we speak, is the close nexus between what the Department of Homeland Security is asking that applicant to provide it in their application and what is in that nuclear governance template. It's really amazing. They're very, very, very close in kind. The Department of Homeland Security is saying to this utility company, we want to know all about your corporate governance structure, your security. Who handles your security? What is the training you provide to your folks about active shooters, about insider threat? What do you do with a disgruntled employee once you release him? Do you follow him or her to see if they're going to try to get back in? They want to know all of that. And they want to know that you have written procedures that you fall back on. And they want to know, do you refresh those procedures? How often do you refresh them? I mean, this is a very, very boring analysis of your practices. And they want to see that you have crisis management practices, that you have remediation practices, the same kinds of items that are in the template. And if you look, the Department of Homeland Security has issued direction to the nuclear electricity sectors for applying for Safety Act coverage. And if you read it, it is it's spot on to what kinds of practices you all are trying to sort of benchmark and identify for this industry. The last thing I would say is that, a couple last points. The European Union did look at and studied, actually commissioned a study to look at whether they would adopt the Safety Act rule there. And they did that about 7 years ago, and they decided, no, don't think so, because we're not as litigious as the U.S., which is probably true. And, you know, there haven't been that many terrorist attacks. Well, and since then, it's changed a little bit. And so there has been a spasm of terror attacks in Europe. And maybe the EU should rethink whether a regime like this would be useful there. The other couple of quick points, we passed the Safety Act regime. We passed the U.S. Terror Risk Insurance Act, TRIA, which stimulated the return of terror insurance to the marketplace. After 9/11, immediately after, the terror insurance industry dried up. The insurance companies ran for the hills. They stopped writing terror insurance and started writing exclusions for terrorism. The passage of TRIA reignited the marketplace. And lastly, in 2015, more recently, we passed CISA, which is the Cyber Information Sharing Act. It provides liability protections, that's protection from lawsuits for those companies that decide to share, according to the Department of Homeland Security protocols, share monitoring cyber indicator threats, cyber threat indicators or defensive measures. They decide to do that and they share that information. There's some liability protection that can come to those companies. It's a statute that I think still the jury's out on. It's how much that's being utilized is not yet clear, but it's there, and it's some attempt to coax the industry into sharing information about best practices. So it's got laudable intentions. I recently met, and I know Secretary Chertoff is also interested in, I recently met with some House staffers, and the idea is to take the Safety Act, amend it a little bit. The Safety Act is, as I described, is applicable when there's a terrorist attack. What we're thinking of is amending it so that if there's a cyber attack, you don't have to prove that it was initiated by a terrorist. And why? Because attribution is often difficult in cyber situations. The last thing I would say about the template and sort of commenting on the other speakers' remarks too, it is so true what Secretary Chertoff said about, it's hard to find these standards, and there are no prescriptive standards, and NIST provides guidelines and so forth. But we have to keep trying. We have to keep sharing information about best practices or better practices. Going above and beyond minimum standards, minimum regulations is so important. The worst case, frankly, from a tort lawyer's standpoint, is if you're not kept up, if you are not up to speed with industry standards, if you've got your head in the sand and you're not making sure you're aware of what those practices are, the customs and practices of the industry, you're not using them, that's really a bad scene in a court. I think the other practical steps is people, including nuclear operators, for this pocket of liability that we're talking about, or that is not addressed by Price Anderson, this non-radiological event, should look at things like the Safety Act. Absolutely develop better practices and keep apprised of what the benchmarking is, but also look at whether these statutory liability regimes that will coax you into even better practices. I can tell you, doing the utility application, during the application process, we actually improved our processes based on inputs from DHS. We actually did upgrade our processes, so right there was evidence. And the other thing is, you may have insurance for this kind of event, but it may not be enough. It may not be enough, and then you're into your own pocket. You're into your own financial pocket at that point. So those are my remarks.
Thank you so much, Ray. I find you so fascinating to listen to, and your experience is just so incredibly rich in terms of what we're discussing today. Because I know that Secretary Chertoff has a hard stop at 10:45, I just wanted to ask if you had any concluding remarks, and I know you're doing a lot of international work with Chertoff Associates. So how are you advising your international clients on how they reduce risk and mitigate risk in the international security landscape?
Well, I think it comes back to what I said earlier about risk management and having a reasonable set of expectations. And we begin by saying, what is the highest consequence problem? It's different depending on the nature of the client. In the case of energy, it's obviously, putting aside the particular issue of radioactive material release in a nuclear context, it's about continuity. It's about being able to function and all the collateral consequences that occur if you can't. And then it's a question of building layers of defense. People who believe that you can create a structure like a Maginot Line where you'll never be penetrated are smoking a controlled substance, because everybody gets penetrated. The question is, what happens when you are penetrated? And that's where layers of defense, segmentation, continuous diagnosis and monitoring within your network, a response plan, all of those are elements that substantially reduce the risk. So what we're trying to convince people about is not to worry about being inundated with solutions or technological magic bullets, but to think about empowering yourself by having a disciplined set of ways in which you drive down the risk. And finally, the thing we tell people most is, this is ultimately not about technology, but it's about people. It's about governance. It's about your policies. Everybody wants to be able to work from home. People want to sit in Starbucks and log on to the network. And, we go time out. If you're letting people sit in Starbucks with public Wi-Fi and get into your crown jewels, you might as well just open the doors and let everybody come in. So it's really having a disciplined way of building an architecture and a series of policies that ultimately drives down the risk. And then the technologies become enablers, but they don't drive the strategy, they implement the strategy. So that's basically what our approach is.
Thank you. I don't know if you have time for one question.
Sure.
I see there's someone very eager.
I wanted to get in before you had to leave, Secretary Chertoff.
And can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Prasad Kadambi. I'm retired from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory. And I wanted to make sure I was able to ask you about the work that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has done on risk management. There has been quite a bit of work done recently in the past 5 years. And unfortunately, that work is not getting much attention, among the sort of people that you are talking about. And this explicitly addresses the sort of question of layers of defense. And there's a very formal defense in depth approach that is part of our regulatory system. And all these things need to be included within this structure of risk-informed and performance-based approaches to safety and security. That is really part of the way we do things these days. So I'd like to ask you, sir, how are these, improvements in methodologies being incorporated into the kind of work that you folks are doing in the legal field?
So I agree with you. I think the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has done a lot of fine work in risk reduction. I'd say even more generally, the U.S. Power industry, NERC and FERC, do pay a lot of attention to this. I would put the energy industry and the financial system industry kind of at the forefront of paying attention to these issues. And one thing which is interesting is you talk about a global regime of raising your level of capability is to look at these kinds of examples as things that might be adopted more generally, again, as a way of reducing vulnerability to lawsuits by saying, look, we're doing the best in breed. The challenge is always staying ahead of the issue. And, to give you an example, just in the last couple of weeks, there were stories about Intel chips that had hardware-based flaws that had been out there for ages that were just recently discovered. And we again and again learn that even when we think we've locked down a problem, there's often a dimension that is still open. So this is the hardest piece of this, in my experience, is convincing people that you're never done. You're always testing, retesting, and challenging yourself. It is very much of a dynamic process. And it's also one in which you have to look at all the peripherals. Your supply chain, who is having access to your network, even the way you interact with customers and whether there's any possibility of penetration there. So to me, a lot of fine work has been done, but it's not a moment to pat yourself on the back and say, we're done.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to turn to Stephen again because one of the things that I was so pleased to see is that the legal community was really working, or is really working hand in hand with the nuclear insurance community. So we were able, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been able to pull the lawyers and the insurers together. But when I met with Stephen, I realized he was already working hand in hand with the insurers. So I wanted to just see if you could expand a little bit on some of the products, because we basically uncovered a liability for which we have a gap. And if you could just talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK.
Sure. Well, I think the insurers are working on products at the moment rather than having finished products. But the way in which nuclear insurance works in the UK is that there is what used to be called a nuclear pool, essentially a pool of underwriters. It's now a company, nuclear risk insurers. They insure plants not only in the UK but in many other parts of the world. And their business has traditionally been in relation to nuclear liability, which of course is compulsory to have insurance for that. But they can certainly see a gap in the market for insurance relating to cybersecurity risks, because it's a natural extension, it seems to me, of the service they offer, and their underwriting skills are very transferable to that area. Obviously, one of the strengths of nuclear insurance is that it does provide the incentive, one of the incentives that Ray was referring to raise standards, because if you want to get cover and the price at which you get cover, the underwriters will have something to say about the systems which you have in place. And of course, what they have is a very wide perspective across many operators, including internationally, to see what standards are applying. So it's very much a way of pushing up standards to the best. If the underwriters can see that somebody, one of their clients, is operating to a particular standard, then they're going to require that their other clients operate to a similar standard. It's in their interests to do so. They want to minimise the risk of having to pay out. So I think that is potentially a very important transformative tool for standards in this area. And I'm encouraged that certainly the insurers in the UK, they do work closely with lawyers, because obviously we advise them on both the wording, the policies, the nature of the risks that may eventuate, and so on. They're taking it very seriously, and I think that's definitely an area to watch. I think it's no substitute for the type of Safety Act approach which Ray outlined to us. That's well worth considering too. It's not traditionally an approach which we followed in the UK, because whilst way of demonstrating that you're not negligent, it's not conclusive as in the basic position in the US. It doesn't get you out of jail. If you don't comply with those standards, you're in trouble. But if you meet them, it doesn't necessarily provide you with a defence. But having the sort of approach which was described in the Safety Act does seem to me to be well worth considering. One question which did occur to me, having heard Ray, is how long that immunity lasts. Because of course you put in your plan to be considered by the regulators. They sign off on it. There's then a question of, does that plan need to change? Are you actually ensuring the plan is implemented? I was wondering what mechanisms there are for continued scrutiny, if you like, having got to that stage. Is your immunity contingent upon resubmitting the plan, responding to issues, and dealing with new threats as they come up? How does that work?
So
because with insurance, of course, you'd have to demonstrate that every year. Every year you go along to renew. Every year the underwriters are going to look at, does something need to change?
Right. Good question, Stephen. So the way it works is when you get Safety Act coverage, you get a letter from the Department of Homeland Security, as I said, that outlines in some detail what they are giving the coverage for. What are your risk management processes, your governance structure, your physical security deployments, your cyber deployments. It's all outlined in the award letter. And it's called Exhibit A. That is the document that you would submit to the court if you ever were sued after an act of terrorism and said, this is why I should be allowed out of the lawsuit, Judge, because DHS has approved the very processes that the plaintiffs are saying failed that day. And when you get that award, you get Safety Act coverage for 5 years. So those processes that are described in that award letter are protected for 5 years. If there's an act of terrorism during those 5 years that implicate those processes, your Safety Act protection is triggered if you're sued. There is a mechanism for upgrading, for modifying, because as these processes can be fluid, they are hopefully refreshed and updated as time goes on. They are modulated depending on the threat analysis. So what you do is, during that 5 years, if you believe your processes have changed dramatically or materially, the Department of Homeland Security has a modification process by which you submit and say, look, you've already given me coverage, but I wanted to make sure you're aware that we're now doing things a little differently here, there, and here. You describe those in your modification request, and then that gets approved. And you can renew the 5 years. As you approach the 5-year mark, you can renew it for another 5 years, ad infinitum. So it's very powerful and very lengthy protection. The remark you made about the insurers, I think is so important. The insurance companies themselves can be a way that incents industry, right? If they are taking an interest in security practices, the quality of those, the nature of those that a company is utilizing, whether they're complying with the applicable regulatory standards, that would be another way. And then issue insurance to those that they believe are doing those things correctly. That would be another way to incent better practices. My personal experience in the U.S., and I'm glad to hear that maybe the London market and others are looking at it differently, but in the U.S., the carriers here, in my opinion, at least in my experience, don't take that real interest in delving into, now maybe they'll start doing it in the cyber, I believe they are in the cyber area, but taking an interest in a company's security practices for which they're giving insurance. And the quality of those practices. I think the U.S. insurance industry is a little farther behind in getting to that. And that would be I think that's an important prod that could be utilized to incent.
Well, thank you. At this point, I want to open it up to the audience. We have a question here with Mr. Brill.
I just wanted to ask, thank you for the I wanted to follow up on your comments with basically two parts. One, is the request for extension then automatically approved?
The
or
extra
does it go
5
through the
minutes?
same kind of review process
Much,
that happened the first time?
much less. It's much less. Basically, near the end of that 5 years, you will identify any changes that have occurred to what they previously approved, and you submit those changes. So it's a much lesser process. By the way, the process at the front end, first time you apply, usually takes about 120 days for them to review and approve.
Okay, and, well, I might ask that you have experience. How long does it take a company to prepare itself to do something?
Yeah. If they use really good counsel. It depends. I mean, it depends on the nature of the technology that you're talking about. If you're talking about, like we did the Safety Act coverage and got Safety Act coverage, I was telling Catherine, for the World Trade Center New Freedom Tower. Okay, so that's a little more on your plate than I have a camera, I have a wand that is used in the airport to examine, baggage or whatever. So the World Trade Center New Freedom Tower got Safety Act coverage for all of the architecture, design, and security procedures that they are implementing at the facility that are embedded in the architecture and around the campus. So that took a little longer. I mean, I would say that one probably took, and with help from the client, from the Port Authority in that case, of New York, New Jersey, that probably took on and off a couple months to get the application put together. And then when submitted, it takes DHS usually about 120 days. Sometimes they go a little beyond it, depends on the complexity and so forth. Sometimes they come and make a site visit. They came up to the Trade Center twice to view the security processes that were there. And then on your question about the renewal, much less time, maybe take them a couple of weeks to review that and approve.
Let me just ask a final follow-up related to the Safety Act, and that is, is the Safety Act sort of set in stone, and do the regulations sort of keep up with changing practices and standards,
Yeah.
or is the Safety Act been revised at all, amended in any way?
The Safety Act has not been amended since its passage in 2002. I can tell you that industry was so pleased with the passage that we've all been loath to have it reopened because we're always wary of Congress taking from us the gains we've made through that statute. We're so pleased with the statute passing with flying colors. And I wrote the core provisions in June of 2002. It passed in 6 months later. It was a statute, and with very little opposition to it. And so it's never been amended since, except we're thinking about, as I mentioned, tweaking it for the cybersecurity attack to take out the requirement that we have to show it was a terrorist attack behind it. But other than that, no, it hasn't been amended. As far as the regulations go, there have been 2 or 3 iterations of regulations since the passage in 2002. They came out in like 2004, 2006, 2008, regulations that were, and honestly, those regulations are quite robust. The regulations haven't been updated or refreshed, but many of the issues that were embedded in the Safety Act were vetted all through those times, and DHS weighed in with the regulations that then implement the acts and interpret those issues, I think, in ways that are very favorable to the industry. But what DHS does do, short of issuing new regulations, is they send out these great directives, guidelines on pursuing this kind of coverage for the utility industry, for the power industries, for the cyber industry. They do a good job of that.
I think Gerson had his hand up first. Looks like we have quite a few questions, so please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm a former senior advisor here at the Stimson Center. And I was involved in the very, very first incarnation of this study at the Stimson Center. And I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Tromans and one for Mr. Biagini. Mr. Tromans, I was interested to hear you say that training is still kind of low on the horizon with respect to issues of liability and risk and so on. That's really where this study in a much, much earlier incarnation started with regard to training of nuclear operators in high-risk countries. It was a State Department grant. So, and I know that WINS has been very involved in training. At first, we were trying to determine whether there were standards for training, and it was kind of messy. So my question for you, sir, is the reason the training is still kind of low on the horizon, as I said it, is that because it's a much more difficult issue? It's more difficult to issue standards or to define quality. And for Mr. Biagini, my question for you, sir, is whether the standards themselves that are renewed every 5 years are reviewed by DHS for their adequacy, because the adequacy of a specific standard, even if it's re-examined and the compliance is re-examined and renewed, doesn't necessarily mean that the standard itself is still reasonable after 5 years, especially in an area like cyber, as Mr. Chertoff mentioned.
So, Stephen?
Yeah, I guess training is a more difficult issue and a more nebulous issue in cybersecurity than perhaps it is in nuclear safety or physical security. Partly because I think the standards are less developed. Partly because I think it's perhaps less easy to identify, if you like, safety critical people within a nuclear facility. Obviously, in relation to sensitive operations, only certain people are going to be authorized to undertake those operations, and one would expect them to be trained to a very high standard. Clearly, cybersecurity can, in a sense, be compromised by almost anyone who has got access to the network, not acting in an appropriate way. So the training maybe needs to go much wider. But I think at heart the same principles apply in the sense that within the safety aspects of the nuclear industry, one would expect the operator in a regulatory sense in the UK to have what's called a nuclear baseline. There would have to be clear information as to the numbers of staff and the experience and the qualifications of those staff necessary to address safety critical factors. So there would need to be what are called suitably qualified and experienced personnel, and the company would not be allowed to let its personnel fall below that baseline in the sense of numbers and qualifications and training, and the training would have to be regularly kept up. So I think maybe this has to be approached in two senses in the cybersecurity sense. Obviously, you have those who are dealing at a very interface level with security issues, who do need to be trained to a high level, suitably qualified, vetted, all of those things. But of course, you then have a much wider body of people in the organisation who also need to be vetted, trained, etc. I think the industry is perhaps more easy at the moment in itself in dealing with that first category. And in the second wider category, and it may be that that's where lies the challenge that hasn't yet been grasped.
Okay. Ray?
Yep. When you ask about standards, are you talking about company internal standards, or are you talking about standards that are established by the industry, by government?
I'm talking about the standards that you certify as immunizing a company against liability. are those, maybe I'm not using the right words, but are those standards themselves re-examined frequently by DHS as the security environment evolves?
Right. I know that at the front end of an application, in the power area, DHS actually asks for you to identify, the applicant to identify all standards by which you think you're acting, complying with, acting against, and whether those are internal company standards that have been developed over the years, whether they are industry standards or guidelines, whether they are, nuclear regulatory regulations. They want to know, what are you conducting yourself against day by day? Then they want to also know, they want the evidence that you believe you are in compliance with those, and then they want any evidence that you have that you are acting above and beyond those. There have been times when I've done applications where either I will pull the application or the Department of Homeland Security will say, we're not sure this standard that either you have internally developed or that you're using as an industry standard is really robust at this point. Is it really the one that, let me back up. The Safety Act Office utilizes the Institute for Defense Analysis as their major reviewer organization. Pockets of expertise is within the Institute for Defense Analysis. They'll have cyber expertise, they'll have bomb detection expertise, they'll have on and on. And they also utilize FFRDCs to review certain types of applications. They will get referrals to expert regulatory agencies like the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where they will call them in to the application process and say, what do you think of this application? What do you think about these standards? So it's not cursory. And they do push back where they will say, the standard we don't think your standard is robust enough, or we don't think your standard reflects what the industry is doing. Or it certainly may not reflect what the government wants you to do. So they are scrutinizing. Your question is a good one, though. So once you get the coverage, okay, and given the fluidity, right, I think is what you're pointing to, of particularly in the cyber arena, how often do they come back to you during that nice quiet period of 5 years where you have this coverage? And in the cyber area, I know they have made inquiries back to companies that have gotten coverage for their cybersecurity offerings, and said, even in the award letter, they will say, please come back to us in a year and tell us what's changed. Tell us if your standards have changed. Tell us if you think an industry standard has changed. So there's some proactivity there. It's pretty good. It's hard to keep up with all the changes that occur so quickly in that world. But I think the Safety Act Office also will go to bad. They use NIST a lot as a referral for cyber-related applications. So.
Okay, just briefly follow up. You mentioned, I think, maybe Secretary Chertoff, that there are 950 standards.
Yeah, I said that. I said there were 950 or so awards.
Oh, 950 awards. Oh, okay, fine. Because I was
Roughly.
wondering whether whatever standards they are that the department approves are reviewed and updated. But I think you've responded.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I just mention one other thing that I just want to make sure? One of the concerns I have is when you have these federal statutory regimes that are liability protecting regimes, like CISA and like the Safety Act, and they're out there for the industry to invoke, right, to pursue, and you don't pursue them, you don't partake. Not only does it not, in essence, help you raise your own game by going through the process of invoking those, but I worry sometimes as a and I try to think like a plaintiff's lawyer because that's what I defend against, plaintiffs who bring these lawsuits. Plaintiff's lawyers, at some point, if there is a big non-radiological event that causes massive damage, will sue everybody up and downstream. And they will claim that your standards aren't adequate or your procedures weren't adequate and you were negligent. And if you do get hit with a big suit like that, and you haven't gone through these processes to invoke these protections, these statutory protections, not assuming there are no plaintiff lawyers in this room, my concern will be one day some plaintiff's lawyer is going to say, you know what, the board of trustees, the executives of the company were negligent as it relates to their own shareholders. If they're publicly traded shareholders, Sarbanes-Oxley requires you to exercise due care to your shareholders. Well, if you have a statutory fix out there, prevention, like liability caps or presumption of dismissal, and it's sitting there, and you knew about it or should have known about it because it's a federal law, it's not like it's hidden, you need to partake in that. So I worry about derivative shareholder suits downstream.
So we're over time. I am going to take one more question, and I think Sue had her hand up, but also, did you? Yes, okay. And also, I really want to invite people to stay and talk to the experts. I don't know whether or not that will be possible with Stephen.
I'm afraid I need to
Okay.
close off, Catherine, because I set aside, we started a little bit late, so...
We did. So was your question for Stephen or
It's probably more towards Ray.
Okay, so we'll say cheers. Stephen, thank you so much. As they say, it was brilliant. So having you here was brilliant,
Thank you all very much.
and really look forward to seeing you.
Very nice to speak to you, and nice to meet you.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for fitting me under the gun. I'll be brief, but I have a question that's been bothering me for a while. My name is Sue Perkins Grew. I'm the Senior Director of Security and Incident Preparedness for the Nuclear Energy Institute, which means I'm responsible for the commercial industry here in this country. Ray, so one thing that I constantly ponder, and it has to do with the relationship between the private sector and the government sector. So we have a design basis threat for which we, as a private sector, private security forces, must be prepared to defend against. So a lot of these things that we talk about are enemy of the state. They are nation-state actors that threaten us, threaten our industry, threaten us. So I've never gotten a clear answer. So in these scenarios, where is the government sector's liability, because they are responsible to some degree to protect critical infrastructure. And that's something that's not really talked about. So we as an industry keep getting tweaked up for more preparedness, more defense in depth. But okay, so where is the federal partner in this?
Well, I'm afraid to tell you that suing the United States government in tort for, let's say you feel that after an attack, the government failed in some respect to adequately convey the threat, identify the threat ahead of time, whatever. They failed to implement their own appropriate defensive measures, countermeasures, mediation measures. It's very difficult to sue it would be very difficult for the individuals who were victims, harmed, businesses that were disrupted, for them to turn around and sue the United States for those failures. Very difficult. Why? Well, first of all, there's the concept, we get it from England, too bad he's gone, the king can do no wrong concept, sovereign immunity. And while in the United States in 1940 or so, we passed a law called the Federal Tort Claims Act that says, okay, the king may be able to do some wrong here, and we're going to allow our citizens some ability to sue the United States in tort if they feel the United States has injured them. But, said the same statute, we're going to exempt the United States from suits if they involve the United States' exercise of discretion or judgment over decisions like how much security to deploy, how much warning to give. And when the United States is acting with discretion, says the statute, even if that discretion is abused, the United States can't be sued. It's only if the United States is acting in a way that doesn't involve discretion, but rather is ministerial in nature, checking boxes that they have to check. And if they fail on that kind of activity, there's a pathway to suing the U.S., very narrow. But 90% of the 5% of the lawsuits when the U.S. gets sued in tort for some failure, whether it's in the nuclear industry or whatever, the United States will exit the lawsuit because there was a premium placed by Congress years ago on protecting the government's ability to exercise discretion and not be looking over their shoulder all the time. Well, if we do that, then we're going to get sued. Congress didn't want that. So I hear you, and it comes up all the time in many different ways, where you'd say, it's really the government's fault. I represent military contractors all the time, and our contractor clients go to war with the United States. We go to Iraq, and we do things that the United States Army used to do. Now the contractors do them in the battlefield. And we do these things, and then after we do them, somebody gets harmed or whatever and thinks they were harmed by what we did, and they sue us in court in the U.S. They sue the contractors. And we say, well, we're in a battlefield. We were only doing what we were supposed to be doing. The United States told us where to go, when to go, and all blah, blah, blah. But they can't sue the U.S., so we get sued. So it's a issue near and dear to my heart, but until that law is ever changed, and it won't be, I don't think it'll ever be adjusted, that's the lay of the land. So that's why contractors and nuclear operators and so forth, they are much more of the vulnerable target for lawsuits than the U.S. would be.
Thank you so much. That I actually would love to talk about design basis threat further, so I invite all of you to stay, have coffee, get something else to eat, ask Ray questions, or we can, I know Miles is also an insurance expert in many of the same areas, so please stay, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.